All right, we're live. Welcome. This is episode 13 of TR Live. I'm Brent. I'm here tonight with Jeff Groom.
Hi, good evening.
And John and William S. Lind.
Evening.
We don't have a whole lot of housekeeping to start off with, so we can dive right into the news. But I will just mention real quick, if you want to participate in the show, as always, you can comment in the live chat or send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com. We'll read questions, comments on the air and address them, and that's how you can participate if you're listening. So, Bill, you had something you wanted to lead off with immediately.
I do, because we here at TR have a scoop. We have what I think is the inside story on one of last week's news events, namely President Trump's announcement that $35 billion worth of federal funding for higher education is going to be tied to freedom of thought and expression on college and university campuses. Now, this is a huge deal. It may not seem so in terms of what's been in the headlines, but it's huge because the universities are the cultural Marxist base. And in far too many cases, they own them lock, stock, and barrel because effectively they forbid any other views to be presented to the students. They see the universities as a psychological conditioning mechanism. And of course, the conditioning is interrupted if the students are exposed to any conservative views. And we all know very well what happens to conservatives on campus, how often they are persecuted, they're graded down in classes if they don't use gender-neutral, grammatically incorrect English. There's sometimes their speakers are shouted down and all of the rest of it. So what President Trump did this week there is a large Zeppelin raid directly on the enemy's base, and that's significant. More significant for us here at TR is there's a good chance that this began right here with TR in Cleveland, Ohio, right where you see John and I sitting now, because I have the backstory. What happened is I'm a member of the board of the Hopkins Institute, which is a group of conservative Dartmouth alums who've been trying for some years, again, to give students at Dartmouth an opportunity to be exposed to conservative ideas. And of course, the administration has ignored us completely. I said, if we're going to get anywhere, we need to go top down, not bottom up. This, by the way, is a basic rule of politics. If you're going bottom up, you come in as a supplicant, you're either ignored or kicked in the teeth. The way you get something to happen politically is to come in top down. You come down on the center you're targeting from a higher political level. Well, there's no higher level, obviously, than the White House. So I said, what we need to do is go to the administration with a proposal, which I wrote up as a memo for our board members, to link federal funding to education, specifically including research grants, to freedom of thought and expression on campus. And I said, it's got to include research grants because the normal dynamics on campus is the faculty meetings that pass all these idiot regulations, essentially outlawing conservative speech, are dominated by the liberal arts types. The hard science guys don't go. Well, if their research funding is at stake, believe me, they'll go and they will outvote the libs and they will vote in some pretty strong policies on freedom of thought and expression. So, as I say, I wrote this up and let me read a little bit of the memo. The problem of discrimination against conservative faculty, students, and outside speakers by colleges and universities is not restricted to Dartmouth. It has become general throughout academia. The same college administrators and faculty members who demand diversity in all things also require uniformity in the one area most important to any academic institution, thought. Any ideas that contradict political correctness, including arguments for free markets, traditional morals, and Western Judeo-Christian culture, are subject to censorship. Faculty, students, and speakers who express conservative views find their careers threatened, face college discipline, or are simply shouted down, with no penalties imposed on those who threaten violence. The origin of these practices is Herbert Marcuse's essay on liberating tolerance, which called for tolerance for all ideas and viewpoints coming from the left and intolerance of all ideas and viewpoints coming from the right. This is what college administrators and professors now mean when they call for tolerance. I went on to reference the very strong statements on freedom of thought and expression that the University of Chicago has issued, starting with their basic policy in 2014, and adding in a letter to incoming freshmen of the class of 2020, specific references to trigger warnings and safe spaces, saying there will be no such things at the University of Chicago. If you come here, expect your views to be challenged. This is, of course, exactly what academia should be. And what I note, and here's the operative paragraph, however, the Trump administration can do what we thus far have not been able to accomplish. If the Department of Education were to require any college or university receiving federal funds, including research grants, to adopt the University of Chicago statement, freedom of thought and expression would be restored very quickly. What the administration has done has not specifically referenced the University of Chicago statement, but it has specifically aimed at research funds, and they mentioned the trigger warnings and safe spaces in the administration statement. I think the circumstantial evidence is fairly strong that this happened because of this memo that, again, we originated right here at Traditional Right in early February. I asked in the board meeting if there were any other members of the board who had the ties to get this into the administration. One of our board members said, I do. I sent him the memo, he sent it in, and the administration would have received it around the middle of February. Early March, President Trump first talked about this, and then, of course, we had the announcement last week. So I think there is a good chance, I hope to be able to confirm this, but I may not be able to, but I think there's a pretty good chance, circumstantially, that it was our initiative that brought this about. And if so, again, we have launched the mother of all Zeppelin strikes on the cultural Marxists. This is going to hurt them if it's implemented. Now, here's the big question. Following set government procedure, the president has directed a variety of agencies through which these funds flow to set up rules that those receiving the funding must follow in order to comply. And the normal rulemaking process takes a while. The rules, proposed rules, are then open for public comment before they're implemented. The deep state obviously is going to hate all this because it's populated by cultural Marxists, including in the Trump administration. And they're going to do their best to sabotage this with the old bureaucratic rule, delay is the surest form of denial. They will be hoping to make sure nothing happens and nothing changes, at least till the end of President Trump's first term. So we're going to have to watch this carefully. If it is implemented, and implemented forcefully as it needs to be, and Betsy DeVos is someone we can trust as head of the Department of Education, she will definitely be with us on this, then we have to look for test cases. For example, let's say that a group of students, and this has happened in various universities, virtually all of these universities have a gay rights organization of some sort. But what if a student or group of students wants to set up an organization to oppose the normalization of homosexuality? Well, they have the same right under these rules, or should have the same right, to get university recognition and funding. If they don't, well, that would be an interesting test case, because that should mean that the administration halts all federal funding, including research grants, to that university. Another case, this could happen very easily, virtually all the women's groups on campus are feminists, but plenty of women college students are non-feminists or anti-feminists. What if those women, again, want to form an organization and get university recognition and funding? If the one side, if the left is funded and they won't fund the right, well, I think that would be a violation. Obviously, if conservative speakers are shouted down, not permitted to talk, and the students who shouted them down receive virtually no penalty, that should be an issue. So I think everything's going to depend on the implementation, but the fact that we've had the President of the United States acknowledge the issue and direct that the one effective action be taken, which is to couple the federal funding with freedom of thought and expression on campus, I think that's a very large success. And again, I hope to be able to confirm it. I may not be able to, but I think the circumstantial evidence suggests that this is our little president, TR's little president to the cultural Marxists on campus.
Well, there you have it. If you want the cutting edge in conservative activism, right-wing activism, look no further than TR.
Absolutely. And if this doesn't work, we're going to tell Jeff to get back in his Cobra and launch an airstrike.
Well, that would actually work because the Cobra uses the Hellfire, which, as you know, Bill, attacks from the top down on tanks. It doesn't fly into the armor. It flies from the top down where the armor set us.
And I can't think of anything that colleges and universities more deserve than Hellfire.
Yeah, we got to get the November variant, so it's the thermobaric one, not the tank killer. We need the thermobaric one. Burn everything up. Yeah.
Well, Jeff, that sort of ties into your bit of news that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so this past week I got an article published with American Conservative about the transgender ban that was finally the lower courts upheld the Supreme Court's decision, or not the other way around. Basically, the Supreme Court said it was allowable, and the lower court that initially put an injunction said, okay, it can proceed. So, and the perspective I took since I was writing for TAC was a little bit more moderate, so they would actually run it, and it was the fact that I kind of blame de facto conservatives or rhinos or neocons mainly for using the military outside of its traditional operating window. And we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. And you can't use the military as a traditional force tool of last resort. That's what it is on paper. And that's what allows it to have the UCMJ and all the traditions that it's had, because people understood that it was a separate organization from society itself. Like, we're represented by society through the Congress, and if we had a draft, we would be represented. But people also understood that, the military has to have its own rules. And I mentioned in the article, when people defend Marines doing blackface parodies, I wouldn't. They should be prosecuted for doing that. That's wrong in the military. But then at the same time, if you acknowledge that, then you have to acknowledge, well, not all forms of expression are okay in the military, and that's traditionally meant forms of sexual expression. So that's where Don't Ask, Don't Tell came from. So liberals argue over just inclusivity and diversity, but we all know that the diversity nameplate says different perspectives make us stronger, which is true. But you open the hood of the diversity card, what do you get? Well, different races and genders make us stronger, which is not necessarily a true statement. And actually, it hurts an institution when you have too much diversity. And so that was the take I had on that situation. And of course, the trolls on Twitter, as soon as the article posted, were saying, "Oh, this guy, would probably force segregation in the military," and all these things. So it was a good article. I was really proud of it, and it got a pretty good reception with the TAC staff. So, but I mean, we're one election away now from possibly open transgender service in the military if we get the wrong president in there, because it's boiling up the frog in water. They got Don't Ask, Don't Tell, women in combat, and now the transgender thing tough stop. But once these things are enacted, it's very, very hard to roll them back and stop them.
A couple years ago, Jeff, I was talking with a Marine 4-star, and he said, we are having to spend millions and millions of dollars to try to accommodate transgender Marines. Then he said, do you know how many of them there are? 6.
That's a good joke.
Absurdity.
Yeah.
Ideology at work.
Right.
And of course, you're correct. Military policy has to be based on military effectiveness, because every time you compromise military effectiveness for political or other reasons, you will pay the price in blood and in defeat. It's not just a waste of money. It's not just, well, maybe politically this didn't work, like a new welfare rule doesn't work. In every time you depart from military effectiveness, you pay in defeat and you pay in unnecessary avoidable casualties. And that should be a moral imperative. And unfortunately, to our policymakers these days, it is not. And that, by the way, I include the senior military leadership in that. It is most certainly not an imperative for them. When President Trump first moved to take the transgenders out of the military, the senior brass objected, if you can believe it. It just shows how absolutely corrupted they are by the system.
Right. It's the length of the wars have changed what the what's most important is that the way the American people now see the military. The length of the wars has in a way changed what the American people think the military is supposed to do. And so if the Marine Corps and the Peace Corps in practice are no different, if we're only in Afghanistan to have female transition teams that they can frisk, female Afghans so they won't get offended. Like people think they see that, oh yeah, that's a good thing. Females are, we're doing the good thing. It's like, well, it has nothing to do with winning the war. Like it has nothing to do with it. It's the American people now have a different perception of what the military has traditionally been. That's why I think it's another symptom of the civil military divide, really.
Okay.
One interesting side effect that you might see is an influx of a lot of mentally ill people into the military because they'll go to the military to get their sex change surgeries done because that'll be covered because that's the recognized treatment for gender dysphoria syndrome or whatever.
Yeah.
So as soon as the word gets out that the government will pay for all these just barbaric surgeries for these people, you'll get a lot more of them.
Right. No, that's something I think we haven't even accounted for, and that's that could happen in the very near future. You're right. Yeah.
Well, as Jeff will probably agree, since he got out as a captain, this isn't too different from something that's been going on for a long time in terms of military surgery. Normally now when you make major, it used to be you got a lobotomy, but now actually it's much more sophisticated. They make a small incision at the base of your spine and they take out your brain, your backbone, and your balls all at once.
Well, at least they only have to go in once.
Yeah, it's a new technique. It's very, very minimally invasive. Not invasive at all. That's funny.
All right, Bill, your turn.
Okay. It's probably actually more your turn because you're more up on the latest news than I am, since I rely largely on steamships and carrier pigeons. But it does appear that, as we all expected, with the Mueller report, the mountain has brought forth a mouse. As virtually everybody knew from the beginning, there is no evidence of collusion with Russia. This was all an invention. And all that this massive and massively expensive to the taxpayer investigation has done is identify some largely procedural errors by some underlings. It's very small potatoes. The fact, again, we don't know the content for the most part yet of the report, but the fact that there are no new indictments and that the indictments so far that have come out have, again, all been frankly, for the stuff that every campaign manager does. I mean, that's politics, folks. It's not pretty. This whole thing has been a farce from day one.
Yeah, all I was going to say was that this is the headline news right now. This is the big major story. And for me personally, I don't think it's a big deal at all because we all knew that there was nothing here and nothing's really going to change for the rest of his term either.
Well, again, it's the big story is, or should be, that all of this hoo-ha came up with nothing, effectively. That should be news. And that should lead to some soul searching as to, so why did we do this in the first place? Who was behind this? Who are the people who demanded?
That's really what it is it should call into question the origins of this whole thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who cooked up this witch hunt in the first place?
Paid for it.
And by the way, since all of us had to pay for it, and believe me, it's not cheap. You're talking about a lot of lawyers' time. Are the people who demanded this in the first place going to be sent the bill? That certainly is what should happen.
Yeah, that's how it works for all of us.
Yes, exactly.
An interesting thing that I actually just thought of was that right when this whole Russiagate thing was kicking off, I remember there was this like hidden video that like hidden camera video that was kind of circulating Twitter at the time, where it had, and this is the part I'm not remembering quite as clearly. It was either it was a program director for either like CNN or it could have even been NPR, somebody like that. He was saying like, yeah, of course this Russia thing is bullshit, but you know, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to you know, play our part in the quote unquote resistance.
Yeah, Brent, I think it was the Veritas documentary.
Yeah.
They were the ones that kind of exposed that.
But that never got any more play, not even on like Fox News or anything.
Of course not.
They never did reveal, and they couldn't reveal who and where they got the WikiLeaks from that they're trying to blame that on Trump. That was the one thing that they never could prove. And I don't think they could, because that would probably open up a can of worms that they just didn't want to open.
Well, you know, not even that, but this program director was saying blatantly that he was making it up. And nobody went any further than that. Like nobody took that.
Well, the whole thing was based on the Russian dossier that was obviously bought and paid for.
Well,
it's fake.
That whole like there's that bit where he supposedly paid hookers to pee on him in Russia or something.
Yeah, on the bed, yeah.
Well, what's funny was that was entirely concocted on 4chan.
Completely.
To try to get journalists to believe it, and they did, and then that became, you know, part of government documents. It was completely made up on 4chan.
Yep.
That's awesome. Well, to me, the biggest casualty of all of this is the fact that Trump ran on a policy of détente with Russia and having better relations with Russia. And while this entire cloud of investigation was over him, we get out of the INF treaty, we arm Ukraine, we start posturing with Russia, we're going to put bases in Poland. Like, that was not what he ran on, and I don't think that's what he wants to do. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see is now that this is gone, Trump actually pursue détente with Russia, which is what we need. We need détente with Russia. We can't afford to be enemies with make-believe superpowers for, you know, rest of our lives. It's just insane. But that's the military-industrial complex. It has to have enemies. So that's what I'm fascinated to see in the future.
I think, Jeff, that it actually goes a step beyond that. I think one of the main motivations for concocting this whole Russiagate thing in the first place was to prevent President Trump from seeking a détente with Russia.
Of course.
Because it's not just linked to it. I think it's causal here. It's one of the causes, certainly. I mean, obviously another cause is they were just going to throw anything at the barn wall and hope something stuck. But the military-industrial complex needs Russia and China as enemies, even though the notion we're going to fight wars with them is absurd because they're both nuclear powers. But it needs that to justify the big ticket programs and the $1 trillion a year for the quote national defense function in budget committee speak. So I think there's a causal relationship here, and it just again shows how corrupt the whole military side is, not just the civilian side of government. Everybody knows that's corrupt and incompetent. But what too many Americans don't know is the same is now true on the military side as well when you're speaking about the higher leadership.
Right, exactly, yep.
Okay, I have a few items.
Yeah, Bill, did you have anything else?
I do. This is a very worrying sign. This is from today's New York Times. U.S. airstrike is said to kill 14 Afghans. Okay, well, we know that happens all the time. Airstrikes kill civilians, but this is different. After the second firefight in the past 10 days between American soldiers and their Afghan allies, at least 14 civilians, most of them women and children, were killed in an American airstrike on Saturday in northern Kunduz province, according to Afghan officials. At least 4 Afghan soldiers were also killed. What comes out is we called in an airstrike knowingly on the Afghan army, on our allies. The episode on Saturday came a day after 2 members of an American Special Forces unit and their and 4 Afghan Special Forces soldiers were killed during a joint operation in Gultepe district. The latest episode, and Jeff, you can just picture this in your mind just like I can. The latest episode began about 3 a.m. Saturday after a convoy of American and Afghan Special Forces left the area of the previous day's combat, and an armored vehicle used by the Americans broke down as they were heading to a security checkpoint. When the soldiers got out to fix the vehicle, an Afghan soldier nearby opened fire on them. At that point, everybody started shooting at everybody else. And an Afghan commander said the 2 allies exchanged fire for 20 minutes before there were airstrikes, which he said had killed 12 civilians and 6 soldiers. The situation in Afghanistan is going from bad to worse very rapidly. And there's a huge danger here that I've written about repeatedly and that nobody seems to recognize. And that is, we may find getting out of Afghanistan isn't easy. The British found that in the 19th century. They lost a whole army there. There was 1 survivor. The Afghan government knows we're done with them for good reason. I mean, the war in Afghanistan should have been 2 months long at most, not what now, 17 years, 18 years. They know we're done with it. They know we're negotiating with the Taliban. Those negotiations are going well. We aren't pulling the Afghan government into the negotiations because they're a bunch of hopeless idiots and losers. And they're simply going to be told, here's the deal. You don't like it, tough. With the Taliban winning, which is what's going to happen, everybody in Afghanistan is going to be looking for a way to ingratiate themselves with the new rulers. And that's going to include the Afghan police and armed forces. Well, what's obviously one way to do that? It's to attack the Americans. These kinds of incidents, whether that's what happened here, I don't know. But these kinds of incidents clearly will grow in number as that begins to happen, and they will feed it because there's a tremendous amount of resentment on the part of the Afghan army and police forces toward the Americans. Same thing was true in Iraq. We've come in, we've messed up the situation completely, we've killed all kinds of people, we live far more secure lives than the Afghan troops and their families do. We've got the greatest medicine, we've got safe food and water, all of those kinds of things they don't have. This builds tremendous resentment. And when you add in the political motivation that the war is ending, the Taliban's going to win, and the people in the Afghan armed forces have to make their accommodation with the new powers that be, we could find that we have to do a fighting withdrawal out of Afghanistan. And that is going to be a real mess.
Wow, I never really thought about that. That's fascinating. Because we have so much gear and people and fobs and everything that we've put over there over the last 18 years. Like, in order to get it out, like it's going to take time. And then when we do that, we're going to be open.
Well, a Sav-Quepo route, you don't worry about the gear. But the problem is getting the guys out. I mean, we have the military-industrial complex will be more than happy to replace the gear at the taxpayer's expense. But the problem is our troops.
Right.
And how do we get out? What's the route? Through Pakistan? Well, we haven't exactly made friends with the Pakistanis lately. The other alternative is to the north, and you've got to get out through Russia, which brings us back to the fact that it would be nice if we had a working relationship with the Russians instead of the hostility that the military-industrial complex needs to justify its budgets. But there's a real possibility here, and also with our troops in Iraq and in Syria, if we go at it with the Iranians, because those troops are surrounded by Iranian-controlled Shiite militias. They also could suddenly find themselves essentially playing Custer at the Little Bighorn. So these are the kinds of dangers that the sorts of morons who make our policy in Washington never think about because they have no historical understanding. They have no understanding of war. And all the generals think about is budgets and careers. So we are running some risks here that I fear are not recognized and could prove to be real disasters. Speaking of another real disaster, and the morons who are making policy in Washington, piece from today's Sunday New York Times entitled "North Korea Urges South Korea to Distance Itself from the U.S." Well, of course it can't because of it needs the nuclear guarantee. But that's not the interesting part here. As we all know, President Trump's very important and long overdue effort to end our confrontation with North Korea that goes back at this point to 1950. I'm the only one, I'm sure, on our show here who was alive when that started. That effort has been sabotaged from within his own administration. We've now reached the point, and this is a real marker, by the way, where the statements coming out of Pyongyang are more realistic than those coming out of Washington. Because Pyongyang has said, we recognize that President Trump wants a deal, but Pompeo and Bolton are sabotaging it. And that's exactly what's happened. The Times reports the Hanoi summit meeting broke down when Mr. Kim insisted that the most punishing United Nations sanctions against his country should be lifted in return for a partial dismantlement of his country's nuclear program. Well, that's a reasonable demand. If we say you have to dismantle everything before you get anything, we're demanding unconditional surrender. He can't do that. It would destroy the Kim dynasty's legitimacy. Before the Hanoi meeting, analysts had feared that Mr. Trump might sign onto a partial denuclearization deal and claim it as a victory, which he should have and which it would have been. But in the end, he listened to his aides' advice and walked away without a deal. After the Hanoi meeting, Mr. Trump has continued to reaffirm his good relationship with Mr. Kim and his willingness to make a deal. But the American president's aides remain firm against lifting sanctions, arguing that it would deprive Washington of its most powerful tool to force North Korea's complete denuclearization. Well, again, North Korea is not about to surrender unconditionally, which is what that demand is. Of course, we've seen President Trump just in the last few days block new sanctions on North Korea that these aides, again, read Pompeo and Bolton, both neocons, have been trying to force through. So his gut instinct, which is right, is we need to end this, and we can end it. But he can't overcome the sabotage from within his own organization. This was what my column was about in the latest issue of the American Conservative. It's titled "The Soft Coup." It's the way the president, instead of saying you are fired, which he was noted for before he became president, just allows these people in his own administration to sabotage him openly. And they do it repeatedly, and they suffer no penalties. As I said there, if they tried that under FDR or under Eisenhower, they would have been fired before they could have even put their pipes out. Happy the day when we could smoke our pipes. This is perhaps the president's greatest weakness. And it's the flip side of the strengths he gets from coming in not as a member of the establishment.
Because what I've said before many times is that his like in situations like this, it's really evident that he just simply doesn't know what he's doing.
Right.
He doesn't understand geopolitics at all, probably, and he's just in way over his head.
I would argue that his instincts in geopolitics are actually pretty good. They certainly are here. They are in terms of seeking a better relationship with Russia. They are in telling NATO, stop expecting us to defend Europe. You've been quite capable of it yourselves for the past 50 years. Where he doesn't know what he's doing is how to staff his own White House, because he has turned to the Washington establishment, the establishment conservative think tanks, the Republican Party, who of course are all establishment. And if you fill your administration with establishment people, you're not going to have an anti-establishment administration because they're going to sabotage you. And again, they're doing so openly. My conclusion in my piece for TAC is that history's verdict on President Trump will be that he wanted to be an anti-establishment president, but didn't know how.
Do you think he's putting establishment people in place to make establishment decisions to bring light to that establishment mindset?
No, I think first of all, that can't be done. You'll never bring light to that establishment mindset.
Well, if Pyongyang saying, yeah, hey, Trump wants this and his people are saying something else, it's kind of bringing light to that.
Well, okay, I see what you're saying. You're never going to.
Will it do anything? Not really.
No. You will never get the establishment to see where it's wrong because it doesn't care whether it's right or wrong. It's playing an inside politics game. It's about careers, bureaucratic empire, budgets, etc. It's not about the outside world at all. So being right or wrong in the outside world in policy terms is immaterial in the establishment. And that's why you see these neocons.
Maybe the point he's trying to make is that it's become that. It's become so meaningless. Look at the state of the political establishment that it doesn't matter.
Then what he needs to do is call a news conference, say that, fire Pompeo, fire Bolton, and fire a whole bunch of the other people he's got working for him.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't think that's likely to happen.
Regarding Kim, there's simply no way that he'd ever denuclearize. I mean, like you've said, he can't for political reasons. It would delegitimize him. But I'm sure that he's seen what has happened to other regimes who've agreed to denuclearize or completely get rid of their nuclear programs or their WMDs. Gaddafi might have a little something to say about that.
Well, and Bolton, to show you how blatant the sabotage is, when Trump first made his opening to Kim, Bolton came out and said, yes, we're looking at the Libya model here.
Well, okay. I mean,
yes.
I don't think Kim wants to get sodomized in the street.
By a camel, I think, in Gaddafi's case. But this was a blatant attempt to sabotage.
Yeah.
And he didn't get fired. See, this is the problem. The "you're fired" Donald Trump needs to come back from whatever planet he's been vacationing on and fire these guys. The establishment itself doesn't care whether its policies work or not, which is why you see these completely discredited neocons. These are the people who gave us the disastrous Iraq War, probably our most disastrous foreign policy venture, well, certainly since the 19th century. Well, World War I was even more disastrous for Europe and its long-range consequences. But it doesn't matter in Washington how often you're wrong in terms of the real world, because all that matters is where you stand in court politics, court in the old sense of a royal court. These people are courtiers, and they can fail and fail and fail in the outside world. Their policies can bring disaster after disaster. This is true in economics as well. And they come back, they're hired again. They're still considered respected voices and authorities in their field. In the real world, they would have been carried out of town on a rail wearing a liberal coating of tar and feathers.
It's a gentleman's club.
Exactly. And once you're in the club, you can't fail. Look at all of our generals who have failed in Afghanistan. One supreme commander after another has failed. They all were promoted, often becoming service chiefs. They continued to have influence in Washington after their retirement from the military, get big contracts. They're on the boards of defense companies. Those are paid board memberships and so forth. No penalty at all. And I quoted this before, but it's too good not to quote it again. An Army lieutenant colonel some years ago ended his career by writing in Military Review, the Army's principal journal, that a private who loses his rifle gets in more trouble than a general who loses a war. And that is literally true.
Yeah, it's interesting. On a couple of group email chats that I've been on with some guys that I've met through my writing and stuff, former Marines that are interested in like amphibious assault stuff. They started a long thread about pulling out of Afghanistan, and I was just, it still amazes me that Bill's been saying this for years. Like how, I mean, you see their little subtitles as Colonel this, Colonel that. and they're all arguing pretty much exclusively to stay in Afghanistan. They're like, oh, Trump's going to get us out of there. Trump's the coward in chief. He's getting us out, and he's negotiating with these people, and they're just going to renege on everything. I'm like, I literally cannot believe I'm reading what I'm reading. These are senior military officers that are still convinced that we can win there. It's just, Bill's right. Like, the highest levels of our military leadership are garbage, straight up.
They live in a dream world. I remember quite some years after the Vietnam War ended, I was socially visiting a friend who was a senior Army general, and he had another Army general over for dinner. And I mentioned something about losing the Vietnam War, and the other general said, "I will not believe that we lost that war." And I said, "Well,
oh my God,
flying over what's used to be Saigon is now Ho Chi Minh City. That's kind of an indicator."
Yeah.
But he said, I don't care what anybody tells me. I will not believe that we that we've lost that war. It can't happen.
Yeah. Cognitive dissonance it happens to everyone, with Russian collusion and with people that are involved in these wars. Like, it's a factor of human life, and everyone suffers from it sometimes.
But again,
at least in Vietnam, they could define what victory would look like. In Afghanistan, nobody's even really been able to define what our conditions of victory are.
No.
Right.
Because in the end, Afghanistan remains Afghanistan, and we could stay another 100 years and nothing would be any different. That's why it's called the graveyard of empires. But speaking of cognitive dissonance, what does it mean when there is less cognitive dissonance in Pyongyang than in Washington?
Right. Yeah.
That really, that thought is a somewhat distressing one, but I'm afraid that's where we are at this juncture.
Right.
Bill, you mentioned a little bit ago the difficulty of using Pakistan to help exit Afghanistan. Do you know anything about the little spat between Pakistan and India a couple weeks ago? There were some airstrikes carried out by India into Pakistan.
These were essentially a matter of shooting spitballs at each other because neither of them at this point wants a war. The Pakistan conventionally is now much, much weaker than India and would lose very quickly. The problem is, of course, they are both nuclear powers. And the Prime Minister of India, who's up for elections very shortly, probably doesn't want a nuke on New Delhi would probably upset the election, to say the least. So what happened was a Pakistani operation in Kashmir killed 40-some Indian troops. The Pakistanis, of course, denied they were behind it. Almost certainly they were. The Indians had to do something to retaliate, and the airstrike has become the equivalent of the old Sioux counting coup. It's what you do to an enemy when you don't want to do anything real. So India launched some airstrikes. Pakistan shot down an Indian aircraft, captured the pilot, who I think they quickly returned to India. This was all kabuki by two countries that both have to look tough to their populations, but neither of them wants a real fight. So there's not a great deal to that. But our problem with Pakistan has been that we have refused to understand the obvious. We have allowed, and this is the strategic mess that traps us in Afghanistan and that President Trump's trying to get out of. We, with incredible short-sightedness, again, the morons who run our foreign policy really should be in an asylum, encourage the current Afghan government to align with India. Well, Pakistan is already heavily outweighted by India. Now that threatens them with a two-front situation, which is totally untenable. They need a friendly Afghanistan to provide some strategic depth to their own shallow position. Well, that means they have to support the Taliban, because the Taliban are tied to Pakistan as the current Afghan government's tied to India. You can't get the Pakistanis to do what we want them to in putting pressure on the Taliban and coming up with a solution where the Taliban don't win. so long as Pakistan's own interests require a Taliban victory. I mean, this is kind of diplomacy or grand strategy 101, and nobody in Washington gets it. And really because nobody in Washington thinks about any other country's interests at all. This brings us back to the neocons and the neolibs. They're cut from the same cloth, who had this enormous hubris saying the United States is the only real superpower. We can do anything, and everyone else must bow to our will. This is with a military that always loses. And again, this parallel is 17th century Spain. We have seen this before, and the parallel gets stronger and stronger and stronger. As the Spanish military fails more and more frequently, Spain's ambitions grow. Seeing exactly the same thing here. So this failure to think in terms of, okay, what are the interests of the other parties involved here? That's a mistake Bismarck would not have made. Leaves us unable to comprehend the strategic situation in the Afghan war. And if you don't understand the strategic situation, what's the likelihood that anything you do tactically is going to work? Well, basically zero.
Especially when they're not even able to identify what is best in our interests.
Right, precisely. Well, ironically, our interest is to get out of Afghanistan. That's by far and away the most important interest we have there.
Bill, did you have any more bits of news you wanted to discuss?
I will only say that I have slight concern about revealing the fact that we here in Cleveland, Ohio, at the headquarters of TR, may have been the Primamobile behind President Trump's announcement of tying $35 billion in university funding to freedom of thought and expression on campus. I'm afraid that if this is in fact substantiated, people will begin to figure out that secretly the world is governed from Cleveland.
Well, that's the real conspiracy.
That's the real conspiracy, absolutely. And the secret of how that's done is it's all through the typewriter and the telegraph, two technologies that I am 100% sure few, if any, of our opponents have.
Well, then I know for certain you're not behind the last bit of news I have, because recently some photos and videos have surfaced of the F117 Nighthawk flying again out in the desert by Nellis Air Force Base and probably out by Groom Lake. And supposedly rumor has it that it's been flying some operations in Syria too, but it's not officially on the Air Force register.
The F117, that's a very old stealth aircraft.
Yeah, it's officially retired in 2008, but there are new videos and pictures that are out there now. It's for sure confirmed flying again.
I liked it when the Serbs, after they shot down the first one, they shot down two, put a sign by the wreckage in English saying, "Sorry, we didn't know it was supposed to be invisible."
Didn't you have some anecdote about an F-16 pilot being able to see it on his radar?
Yeah. I was talking to a friend of mine, Air Force F-16 pilot. Well, first of all, when it was, I think it was the F-117, it may have been the B-2, one of these stealth aircraft, went on, undertook its first flight out at Nellis. Nellis called the local FAA radar to tell them, hey, the stealth aircraft is up. And the FAA replied, we know, we have it on radar. Because the FAA uses long-wave radars. And long-wave radars detect stealth without any problem. You'd have to have 30-foot thick coatings on the wings to be able to deal with long-wave radars. And the Russians and Chinese have lots of long-wave radars because they keep all the old stuff. In fact, they're making new ones now and selling them around the world because they pick up stealth. But even with the short-wave radar, in an F-16, a friend of mine was out there, Air Force F-16 pilot, there was an F-117 up, he caught it. Now, he said it would come and go on his radar, but he could tell something was there. And these aircraft, all but the F-22, sacrifice virtually all their other air-to-air combat capabilities to stealth. In other words, if you find the thing and you're in a regular fighter, it's toast. Yeah. It doesn't have a chance in a dogfight with you. So the whole stealth business has frankly been a fraud, but it's classic of the fraud that the military-industrial complex, congressional complex perpetrates, because the papers buy into it and it's all this gee whiz stuff, and the public doesn't know. And so we've spent untold hundreds of billions of dollars pursuing a technology that basically doesn't work.
Yeah, one last anecdote, that the radar absorbent material that they use to coat these airplanes, still among the very best, is that which the Germans used on their U-boats in World War II.
Which the Russians have used on their submarines since World War II, but we have not. I believe that we are now starting to do so. But the Russians saw that immediately. And they've always had the anechoic coatings, as they're called, anti-echo coatings for the echo from the sonar on their subs.
Anyway, that's all I've got for news. Anyone else have something they want to talk about?
I think we've pretty well covered it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm good.
We will keep you posted on if I'm able to confirm the fact that that we are the prime force who got the ball over the goal line, at least, in getting the president to go after the cultural Marxist home base on the universities. And if, again, if that is implemented effectively by his agencies, this will be an enormous blow to cultural Marxism, because they will lose their indoctrinating machines on campus.
And remember, if you have questions or comments or even a topic that you'd like us to discuss, put it into live chat while we're live, obviously, or you can send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com and we can read it on the air. I think that's it for all of us here at TR Live. Have a good night.
See ya.